survive the acronyms, the jargon, the FDA language. And today's episode, we're going to actually get into doing some work. This is how to pre-sub like a pro, because if you're not using pre-submissions, you're kind of flying blind and you're not taking advantage of the free ways to interact with FDA. So, do you want to start at the beginning, Michelle? What is a pre-submission and why do people kind of use it?
Yeah. Well, short of that it's free, a pre-submission is a way to ask the FDA what their thinking is on certain topics. Usually you get 3 to 4 questions if you do them well, but it's a way to get FDA's buy-in earlier on in a project, especially if you have anything new or novel. Like, you get their perspective of things that either they're not going to have a challenge with or that they are, and there's a gap in the understanding and education that needs to happen. So they're just a good way kind of to take the temperature of FDA on important things in your submission and get their ideally buy-in, but otherwise just understanding of their position, what they're thinking, where they're at.
Yep. And there's really some important ways that you can leverage the pre-submission process. And one is to just get FDA familiar with your technology if you are coming in with something novel. Something that I've noticed, especially with the pre-STAR template coming out, is that they're asking so much more information on claims and materials of use and your IFU up front. So keep that in mind that FDA is expecting a certain level of detail when you do
Hey, we
pre-submission.
haven't even talked about what eSTAR is. So let's talk about pre-STAR. What is pre-STAR?
Yeah, so Pre-Star is the electronic template that FDA currently right now it has made a voluntary use, but it is the direction that FDA is going. It is now 2025 and FDA is accepting electronic submissions. Um, that seems a little bit late, but they're here now and we're here to
Mhm.
honor it. So it is kind of they're giving you a freebie. You know, you used to just write a pre-submission and then you'd have to print it out and mail it and send a
Mhm.
flash drive and all the good
And
stuff.
there wasn't a whole lot of guidance that talked about what the content should be.
Yeah, and now there is actually a pretty decent guidance document that at least tells you the structure that your pre-submission should be in. And it also has example questions at the end of it. So if you are interested in doing a pre-submission, make sure that you look up the FDA guidance document for pre-submissions. It's got good example questions. There are a couple things to keep in mind. If you think your device needs clinical data, I highly, highly recommend that you provide
Mhm.
your clinical
Mhm.
protocol and your biostatistic sampling very early and upfront to FDA before you start your clinical trial. I would
And
say,
without, and not only, obviously, before you start your clinical trial, because that's the biggest area where FDA and industry don't agree. But I would even do clinical separate from any other types of questions like biocompatibility or benchtop testing.
yep,
And the reason for that is that the expertise that it takes to review and properly advise for a clinical trial is so specific and so deep that if you put too many other questions in there, you're going to jeopardize the quality and quantity of your feedback by the FDA resources, spread in too many places and too thin.
yeah. And remember, FDA pre-submissions can only look at protocol, they cannot look at data. So don't think that you can submit your retrospective data and get FDA to agree if that's sufficient for, a submission or not. They're not going to take a look at that. They only will look at protocols and like testing protocols and biocompatibility protocols. So they really stay out of the data review portion and expect to have that in the submission. But if you've already gotten buy-in on all of your protocols, you can see how much easier your submission is going to go because FDA does review pre-submissions before they look at your 510(k) or PMA or any other regulatory submission. So stick to 3 or 4 topics. If you have clinical, make sure that it's standalone. Make sure that you have enough technological information about about your device to paint a clear picture of what you're making and what you're intending to claim on your device. Those are all 3 good things to keep in mind for your pre-submission.
Mhm.
What else is good information for people to keep in mind when they're writing a pre-submission?
Well, let's talk about some of those things that the FDA asks in the pre-start right up front, because I think a lot of people do pre-submissions before their ideas are well formulated enough.
Yeah.
They haven't done enough thinking from through their claims, much less actually created labeling. Labeling sometimes is one of the last things, but now it's one of the first things they ask to see because the labeling paints the story around your device, what
Yeah.
it does, what its contraindications are, what the warnings are, how it functions, all of those things that the FDA is expecting. They're expecting those to be well articulated much earlier in the process than in prior years.
Yeah, there's definitely a shift of really focusing on, especially like the instructions for use. I think FDA is realizing how critical that is for them to be providing feedback on your technology
Hmm.
because we have seen a number of pre-submissions go kind of corkscrew when FDA misinterprets the technology because they read a description, they have experience kind of tangentially, and then they apply that trying to, because they don't interact with you. You submit it, and then they might ask a clarification question or 2, but they basically have a 60-day timer, and they have to get through all the other
Hmm.
pre-submissions on their desk. So, if
And
they
they have been on point with their timing. Like,
yes, they're publishing their data. They are getting feedback out in 62 days. They are on time with their deliverables, which means that I do think that the quality of feedback has gotten substantially better since COVID, um, but they only have so much time to interpret your device. And so, what FDA has done is shift kind of the requirements onto industry to be further along in the system. So, make sure you have it doesn't have to be finalized, but make sure you have a really good kind of instructions for use that you think is 85% of the way there
mhm,
because it's important for FDA to interpret your technology correctly because if they misinterpret it, you get stuck in a really nasty trap, which is that information, they say it's technically non-binding, but FDA is going to send you feedback that they are going to say is non-binding, but they're really going to consider it binding. If you saw episode podcast 1,
mhm,
and it's gonna be not necessarily applicable to your technology, and you are going to waste the 60 minutes that you have to meet with FDA rediscussing your technology for them to understand and provide context that's appropriate to your device.
right.
Mm,
So
because
we talked,
oh,
I'm
go
sorry, we talked about, kind of keeping it to 3 or 4 questions, maybe grouping them by topic or specialty area. But let's talk a little bit about the best way to word a question to the FDA. That is critical to a successful pre-submission.
yeah, so you should always be, and they, this is the opposite of what you might be thinking. You need to always be writing a leading question. Make sure your question points to the answer that you want, and you need to write all the information that demonstrates that you support that conclusion as the technical expert on your product, and you're just waiting for
Mhm.
FDA to concur that that is the correct
Yeah,
way to move
yeah.
forward.
The question itself is actually very short because you have a position statement and
Mhm.
then you say, does FDA concur?
Yep.
If no, why not?
That is exactly right. So make sure that you aren't just dumping your questions with no context, no kind of positioning, because telling the story and is an art. It's the regulatory art. Never say that regulators aren't creative. We are here to tell a story that takes engineering and marketing and marries it into something that FDA can buy into that's safe and effective for patients.
Hmm.
So make sure you're writing those leading questions and then do not bombard them with questions. Do not, even if you get 3 or 4 topics, do not submit a pre submission with 20 questions or 15 questions. They only have a set amount of time and resources to dedicate to them. If you have a really complex thing, it might be better to submit multiple pre submissions, which I know can grind on people's gears because of the timeline, but ultimately, the best strategy is to keep it simple and targeted and concise.
Yep. And you get better quality feedback with better quality questions, which
Yep.
which seems obvious, but a lot of people want to ask open-ended questions because they want to get what FDA's thoughts are, which on the surface sounds logical, except for you don't want them to think for themselves. You want them to think how you're thinking and what you're thinking about.
And
Like
there's
if
and there's
and they won't consult. So you're not going to get a quality answer back from them if you ask an open-ended question.
And something to be mindful of is that in the pre-submissions, particularly, there can kind of be an almost academic approach. Because if you leave it open-ended and you say, hey, what consensus standards do you think apply to my device? They'll throw every single consensus standard at you
Mhm.
without thinking of the expense or burden to your company and if it's really required to show safety or efficacy. But what will end up happening is that you will have a laundry list from FDA of things that they told you they expected to see. And then when you do your 510(k), you either have to write a position that says, hey, we did not do X, Y, and Z because it doesn't apply, and they have to buy in during your submission, or you have to do another pre-submission to say, hey, you gave us this feedback, this is what we think is the device has changed. We made modifications. This is what we think is applicable and what we're going to go with for future submissions and protocols. It just gets really burdensome because remember, the FDA is an elephant. They never forget. If you've
Mhm.
done a pre-sub, it will stay with you for the life of that technology. And that is, I think, the thing that people take for granted because they say pre-sub is free, low-hanging fruit. What do we
Mhm.
have to lose? And what you have to lose is your credibility with FDA. So it is
Mhm.
very important that you take pre-submissions seriously, that you have enough information to guide them, and that you do not just leave these free open questions because you do have to address them later in the future.
Yep. And the oldest one I've seen, because customers are notorious for this. They hire us and then they just do this document dump. And so we've asked them all these pre-questions, whatnot. They'll say sometimes even like, yeah, we've had a pre-submission. In the document dump, we find they've had 3 pre-submissions. And like, okay, why didn't you tell us this? And they're like, well, that first one was 10 years ago. We have a totally different product now. We didn't think it was relevant. Do you know who knew they had done a pre-submission 10 years ago?
Mhm.
FDA. And they blew the dust off of it. And they sat there with pre-submission from 10 years ago, with pre-submission from 5 years ago, with pre-submission from now. And they looked from one to the other to the other. And then their response was, it does not appear that you have taken into account FDA's feedback in the 2 prior submissions, and that you keep asking the same questions, and our concerns have not changed.
Ouch! That sounds expensive.
Eh,
And sometimes it's the way it goes with pre-submissions. Sometimes you get feedback that you do not want, and you cannot change FDA's minds without really doing a lot of work. If they tell you you need 6 figures worth of testing, it might be cheaper to just do the 6 figures worth of testing. You know what I mean? Like, by the time you argue with them and do the overhead and you burn months and months and months, you probably should have just done the testing because I guarantee you, you probably are going to do it before that product goes to market anyway.
right.
So, those are some tips and tricks on pre-submissions and kind of our experience with them. Michelle, do you have anything else that you want to add and something else that can be helpful?
No, I just think that you have to be so purposeful with your regulatory strategy. So this isn't just with pre-submissions, but regulatory should be in product development and business development. They should all be moving in lockstep.
Yeah.
And so you don't need to have pre-submissions and your marketing isn't bought in to the way you've positioned the product in terms of we've talked about the importance of labeling in the IFU. And if marketing is going to come in later because you didn't run it by them, and add a bunch of stuff or take a bunch of stuff away that the FDA's seen, they might feel a little blindsided, or I'm not looking at the same product anymore or the same risk level anymore. So it's just important that that you are moving as a team
Yeah.
within your company, and that is driving what you're saying about your product and what questions you're asking and why are you asking those.
I think that's great closing remarks. So next time on Device and Conquer, we're going to talk about 510Ks and how to build one like a boss.